Welcome to the story. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and support me. The ground shook beneath Ethan Keller's boots as he stared out through the thick window, past the layers of reinforced steel and plastic that separated him from the nightmare outside. His breath fogged a glass as he exhaled slowly, his eyes fixed on the frozen wasteland beyond. What was once a bustling metropolis now lay in ruins, the streets buried under layers of ash and ice, the skyline fractured and jagged against the gray, sunless sky. The nuclear war had ended over a year ago, but the Earth hadn't recovered. Dust clouds filled with radioactive particles still hung in the atmosphere, choking out the sun's warmth and casting the planet into an eternal winter. Humanity, or what was left of it, had retreated underground, hiding like rats from the cold and radiation. The bunker had been designed to last a few months at most, but here they were 1 year later, clinging to life. Ethan pressed a hand against the window, his rough palm sliding down the cold surface. Supplies were running low, food, water, medicine. All of it was dwindling, and their filtration systems were on the verge of collapse. He knew what that meant. They'd have to return to the surface sooner or later. It wasn't just the mutants that scared him. It was the radiation, the cold, the uncertainty of what they'd find up there. A knock on the metal door behind him made him turn. Dr. Nadia Harper stood in the doorway, her arms crossed over her chest, her face set in that familiar scowl. Her long, dark hair was tied back and her sharp eyes met his. "They're waiting for you in the central hall," she said. "We need to make a decision." He sighed and nodded, his hand dropping to his side. "I know." He turned to face her, fully brushing past her as he left the room. "How bad is it?" Dr. Harper followed him down the narrow corridor, their footsteps echoing off the steel wall. "Bad, the air filters 1T hold out much longer, and we're running out of antibiotics. If anyone gets sick now, there's nothing we can do." Ethan's jaw tightened. "We need to go up, down T. That's what we'll have to discuss," she replied. Not everyone agreed. "Finn Jacobs, I am guessing," Ethan muttered under his breath. "Among others," Dr. Harper confirmed. "He's got a following now. People are scared, and scared people will follow anyone who promises them hope." Ethan nodded, his mind already on the coming confrontation. Finn Jacobs, an engineer who had been with them since the early days, had been pushing for more aggressive action, leading expeditions to the surface, risking more lives to find supplies, maybe even searching for other survivors. Finn had a point, but he also had no idea what was waiting for them outside. They reached the central hall, a large room carved out of the bedrock that housed the remnants of their community. The survivors, all 47 of them, were gathered there, huddled together under dim lights that flickered intermittently as the power grid struggled to maintain stability. The air smelled of sweat and fear. Finn stood near the center, surrounded by a small group of his supporters, his arms gesturing wildly as he spoke. "We can stay down here any longer," Finn was saying as Ethan and Dr. Harper approached. "We're running out of time. We either go up and take our chances, or we wait down here and die slowly." Ethan cleared his throat, and the room fell silent. All eyes turned to him. "I understand your concerns," he began, his voice steady, "but going up to the surface isn't a decision we can make lightly. The radiation levels are still high, and we don't know what's out there. Mutants, Finn interrupted, scoffing. "Women have been hiding from shadows for too long. If there are mutants, we deal with them. We can truly live in fear forever." Ethan felt a surge of frustration. This isn't about fear. It's not about survival. "We've managed to stay alive this long because we've been cautious. If we rush into this, we'll lose more lives, let me say." Finn took a step closer, his voice rising. "If we don't do something now, there won't be any lives left to lose." Murmurs of agreement rippled through the crowd. Ethan scanned the faces of the people he had sworn to protect. Fear was etched into their expressions, but so was desperation. They were looking to him for answers, but even he wasn't sure what the right answer was anymore. Dr. Harper stepped forward, breaking the tension. "Look, we can afford to sit on our hands, but we also can't afford to be reckless. I am proposing a compromise, a small scouting mission, just a few people. We assess the situation, gather what information we can, and report back. Then we decide on the next course of action." Finn's expression softened slightly, though Ethan could tell he wasn't entirely convinced. "Fine," Finn said after a moment, "but it needs to happen soon." "It will," Ethan promised. "I'll lead the team myself." There were no objections, though. Ethan could feel the weight of the decision settling on his shoulder. He wasn't too afraid of what they'd find on the surface. He was afraid of the choices he'd have to make once they got there. The cold hit Ethan like a physical blow the moment they stepped onto the surface. The temperature must have been well below freezing, and the air was thick with ash and dust. He pulled his scarf tighter around his face and glanced back at the others. Dr. Harper, Alex, and 2 other volunteers, a man named Greg and a woman named Lucy, were all bundled up in layers of makeshift winter gear, their faces hidden behind protective masks. The landscape was a twisted nightmare of ice and ruin. Buildings stood half-collapsed, their skeletal frames jutting out of the snow like tombstones. The sky was a perpetual gray, and the sun, if it was there at all, was a distant memory. Nothing moved, nothing lived, at least not yet. Ethan led them forward, his boots crunching in the snow. Every step felt heavier than the last, as if the weight of the world itself was pressing down on him. They barely got a mile from the entrance to the bunker when they heard the first sound, a low growl, almost imperceptible beneath the howling wind. Ethan stopped in his tracks, holding up a hand to signal the others to do the same. His heart raced as he scanned the area, his breath coming in short, visible bursts. There, Alex whispered, pointing toward a collapsed building to their right. Ethan squinted, his eyes narrowing against the cold. At first, he saw nothing. Then movement, a shadow darting between the rubble. It was fast, too fast for him to make out clearly, but he knew what it was, a mutant. Stay close, Ethan said, his voice barely audible over the wind, and be ready to run. They continued cautiously, each step deliberate, each breath measured. The growling grew louder, more distinct, whatever was out there. It wasn't he alone. Suddenly, the mutant charged from the shadows, a grotesque figure, once human, now barely recognizable. Its flesh was twisted and deformed, its eyes glowing a sickly green, its body covered in patches of melted skin and bone. It moved with terrifying speed, its claws outstretched as it lunged at them. Ethan reacted instinctively, raising his rifle and firing. The bullet struck the mutant in the chest, but it didn't stop. It staggered back, but only for a moment before launching itself forward again. Ethan fired again, this time hitting it square in the head. The mutant crumpled to the ground, its body twitching as it lay still. Dr. Harper knelt beside the body, her eyes wide with fascination. Incredible, she murmured. Its regeneration rate must be off the charts. It took 2 headshots to take it down. This isn't the time for a science lesson. Ethan snapped, pulling her away. There's more of them out here. We need to move. They pushed forward, but the encounter had rattled them. Every shadow seemed to hide another threat. Every sound a harbinger of danger. As they reached the ruins of what had once been a grocery store, Ethan signaled for the group to take cover inside. Alex, his face flushed with excitement, leaned against the wall beside his father. That was intense. We were actually doing it. We were surviving up here. Ethan glanced at his son, the boy's youthful enthusiasm, a stark contrast to the grim reality around them. He wanted to protect Alex, to keep him safe in the bunker, but he knew that wasn't possible anymore. Ethan wiped the sweat from his brow, his breath visible in the icy air. Alex might have been excited, but Ethan felt only dread. The surface was worse than he'd imagined, a wasteland crawling with radiation mutants, twisted remnants of humanity's greed and recklessness. The underground bunker had been their prison, yes, but it had also been their sanctuary out here. There was nothing but cold and death. He crouched next to the door, peering through the shattered window frame. The mutants weren't hunting in packs, at least not yet, but that didn't mean they were safe. The wind whipped through the ruins, carrying the bitter sting of ash. He turned to the others. We'll rest here for a few minutes, then keep moving. We need to make it to the supply depot by nightfall, Ethan said, his voice low but firm. Dr. Harper was already pulling out her portable scanner, the small device whirring softly as it measured the radiation levels in the area. Her expression shifted to one of concern. Radiation here is still high. If we don't find proper shelter soon, we're going to start seeing symptoms within a few hours. This place isn't going to cut it for long, she said. Ethan nodded grimly. He expected as much. The nuclear fallout was still strong, and while they were protected by their makeshift gear, exposure would soon take its toll. He just hoped the old supply depot hadn't been completely looted in the chaos that followed the war. Alex sat down beside him, pulling his scarf tighter around his neck. Dad, you think there's still food in the depot water? I mean, it's been a year. What if we find nothing? Ethan glanced at his son, then back out into the ruins. There's always a chance we find nothing. But we won. And unless we try, we can't give up just because it looks bad. That's sort of what survival is. Alex, you keep pushing forward no matter what. Alex nodded, but his eyes flickered with doubt. He was still a boy, despite everything, and the harshness of the world outside had only just begun to sink in. Lucy and Greg had taken up positions by the window, scanning the streets for any sign of movement. Greg was an ex-construction worker, his broad frame now worn down by months of malnutrition, but he was still strong, still capable. Lucy had been a nurse before everything collapsed, and her quiet determination made her invaluable in the bunker. Now she was just as valuable out here, keeping the group focused, alert. We need to go, Lucy said, after a few moments. The wind, some picking up, I don't like the way it sounds out there. Ethan agreed. He could hear it too, a keening howl that rose and fell as if something unnatural was carried with it. He wasn't keen to find out if it was just the wind or something worse. They moved quickly, leaving the ruined store behind and heading deeper into the city. The supply depot was only a few miles from the bunker, but the journey felt endless. Every step was heavy, weighed down by the freezing air and the constant threat of attack. The shadows seemed to shift around them, making it impossible to shake the feeling that they were being watched. Ethan's grip tightened on his rifle as they approached a set of crumbling high-rises. The old depot was nearby, hidden beneath the remnants of a once busy government building. It had been stocked for a catastrophe, but who knew how much remained? As they reached the depot as entrance, Ethan motioned for the others to stop. The massive steel door was still intact, but the lock mechanism was fused, damaged by the war. They would have to force their way in. Greg, help me with this, Ethan said. Greg nodded, setting his pack down and pulling out a heavy-duty crowbar. The two men worked in silence, prying at the door's edges until with a loud groan, the steel gave way. The door swung open, revealing a dark, empty corridor that led down into the bowels of the earth. The air was musty, thick with dust and decay. Ethan flicked on his flashlight and stepped inside, the beam cutting through the darkness. The depot had been untouched, at least by human hands, for over a year. He could only hope it hadn't been looted, or worse, overtaken by mutants. The walls were lined with old posters, government warnings about nuclear preparedness, and faded signs pointing to emergency supplies. The group moved cautiously, their footsteps echoing in the silence. Ethan could feel the tension in the air. Even Alex had gone quiet, his earlier excitement replaced by a nervous edge. They were deep enough underground that they were safe from radiation, but there were other dangers to worry about. They reached the main storage area, a large room filled with shelves upon shelves of supply. Most of it was still there, food, water, medicine, even weapons. Relief flooded Ethan as he realized they had found exactly what they needed. Jackpot, Alex whispered, his face breaking into a grin for the first time in hours. Ethan allowed himself a small smile. Yeah, looks like it. But the feeling of victory was short-lived. Dr. Harper's sharp intake of breath made Ethan spin around, his rifle raised. She was standing near the far end of the room, her flashlight illuminating a pile of bodies, human bodies. Ethan, she said quietly, they're dead, but it doesn't look like mutants got to them. Ethan approached slowly, his heart sinking. The bodies were huddled together, their faces twisted in agony, but there were no signs of external injuries. No blood, no broken bones, just death. Radiation poisoning, Dr. Harper murmured. They must have thought they were safe down here, but something went wrong. The filtration system failed, or maybe they stayed too long without proper protection. Either way, they didn't make it. Ethan felt a cold knot form in his stomach. This place, this catch of supplies, had been someone else. Its last hope, and now it was a tomb. We need to be careful, he said, his voice tight. Take what we need and get out. We can't just stay here long. The others nodded, their earlier enthusiasm replaced by grim efficiency. They worked quickly, packing food, water, and medical supplies into their bag. Alex stayed close to Ethan, his eyes darting nervously toward the pile of bodies, as if expecting them to rise any moment. As they finished gathering the supplies, Lucy spoke up. We should get back to the bunker as soon as possible. This place gives me the creep. Ethan agreed. The longer they stayed here, the more exposed they were. But just as they turned to leave, the sound of something scraping against metal echoed from the corridor behind them. Ethan froze, his finger, hovering over the trigger of his rifle. "Did you hear that?" Greg whispered, his eyes wide with fear. Ethan nodded, motioning for silence. The scraping sound grew louder, closer. And then from the shadows of the corridor emerged a figure. At first it looked human, dressed in tattered clothing, its face gaunt and hollow. But as it stepped into the light, Ethan realized with horror that it wasn't human at all. Its eyes glowed with the same sickly green light as the mutant they had encountered earlier, and its skin was stretched too tightly over its bones, giving it a grotesque, almost skeletal appearance. The mutant lunged forward with an inhuman screech, and Ethan fired, the bullet slamming into its chest. It staggered, but didn't he fall? 2 more shots, and finally, the creature collapsed, punching as it bled out on the floor. For a moment, the group stood in stunned silence, their breath heavy in the cold air. Then Dr. Harper stepped forward, her face pale but resolute. "We need to leave now," she said. Ethan didn't need convincing. They rushed out of the depot, their packs heavy with supplies, but their hearts pounding with fear. The mutants were becoming more aggressive, more dangerous, and the longer they stayed on the surface, the more they were exposed to the harsh realities of this new world. As they made their way back to the bunker, Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching them. The shadows seemed to follow them, the wind carrying whispers that made the hairs on the back of his neck stand on end. They reached the bunker just as night began to fall, the sky darkening to an impenetrable black. The entrance sealed behind them with a reassuring hiss, and for the first time in hours, Ethan allowed himself to relax. But as he looked at the supplies they had brought back, at the faces of the survivors who were counting on him, he realized that this was only the beginning. They had food and water now, but that wouldn't last forever. The mutants were getting stronger, more organized, and the people in the bunker, they were scared, desperate. Ethan knew that the hardest part was yet to come. He was their leader, their protector, but even he wasn't sure how much longer he could hold it all together. The world outside was broken, and it was only a matter of time before the bunker followed.